Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Tess Stanton.
Thompson is a national speaker presenting continuing education training on numerous specialized investigation techniques and first responder interactions with people with disabilities. Thompson served over 25 years in the field of law enforcement as a dispatcher, patrol officer, and a detective, focusing on crimes against at-risk individuals. In 2013, Thompson became a criminal investigator with the state of Colorado and later worked at the Attorney General's office, where she investigated allegations of abuse and neglect of at-risk persons. In 2020, she started Pulse Line Collaborative Training and trains first responders on interacting with people with disabilities. Thompson is also the proud mother of 2 children with significant disabilities. She's a coach with Colorado Special Olympics, and in 2019, Colorado Governor Jared Polis appointed Thompson to the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council, where she also serves on the Legislative and Public Policy Committee. Hi, Allie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. I'm so excited to be talking to you because I'm a trainer myself for the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, and we get so many training requests and questions in general from people in law enforcement. So there's obviously a huge need for what you do, and I'm so glad that people like you are doing it. So can you tell me the story behind starting Pulse Line Collaborative Training?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I was in law enforcement for over 20 years. I worked my way up. I started as a dispatcher and then worked as a patrol officer, as a field training officer, and a detective. And the last portion of my career was spent at the Attorney General's office investigating abuse and neglect against people who are at risk in facilities. And while then the pandemic hit, right? And we were all sent home, and I realized how unhappy I really was. I didn't feel like I was helping anymore, which everybody gets into law enforcement pretty much to help. And I felt like something was missing. While I was at the AG's office, I had the opportunity to train around the country and region on interacting with people with disabilities and interviewing people with disabilities. And I realized that I didn't have the knowledge base that I really needed when I was home with the pandemic and all kinds of things were happening. So I started a research project, and I started interviewing dozens of people with various disabilities on what their interactions with first responders had been, what they wanted first responders to know, and how we could improve kind of the situation with law enforcement and people with disabilities. So I then created this curriculum. I partnered with the Autism Society of Colorado, and we realized that there was a huge need for this. And so we started Pulse Line Collaborative Training, and my business partner has a history in media, and we took we call it IWD, Interacting with People with Disabilities Training. We piloted it with Douglas County Sheriff's Office, and the response was incredible. And I felt happy for the first time in a long time and really knew that this is what I was supposed to be doing. So it's kind of blown up from there.
That's great. And I'm so curious, where does the name Pulse Line Collaborative Training come from?
So we went back and forth for a long time. And, with our vision for IWD is that we can expand it to not only first responders. We already have a module for police, obviously, or law enforcement, and we have a module for fire, but we want to expand it to all service professions. So we want to include medical professions and, teachers and all kinds of service professions. So thin blue line is a thing with law enforcement, and the red line is a thing with fire. And we liked the idea of bringing the medical piece into it. And one day it just kind of hit Pulse Line. We were very intentional on the collaborative part because there's so much I don't know. And we want to collaborate with lots of advocacy groups like the Autism Society of Colorado. And we're collaborating with members of the disabled community to really make sure that their voices are heard. And it's so fun because in our training, we have videos of the people that I interviewed. So they're speaking in their own voices. And hands down, that's been the most popular thing that officers have come back and said, I'm so glad to be able to see and hear what someone with cerebral palsy has to say, right? Or someone with Down syndrome or any of these things. I have a friend who is deaf. And so I interviewed him, and he's so fun. It's been incredible. So that's kind of where it came from. The Pulse Line, we're trying to incorporate all service industries and then collaborative, because we truly believe that to really address these issues, we need a collaboration.
Yeah. So on that collaboration piece, I want to know, what are some big lessons, if there are any, that are kind of top of mind that you've learned from actually facilitating these trainings?
Yeah. So I kind of knew this before I started these trainings, but for decades, officers have been taught this use of force continuum that when met with passive resistance or verbal noncompliance, we're supposed to go soft hands on. And then we have this whole thing of ask, tell, make. So basically we ask somebody to do something, then we tell them to do it. And if we still don't get compliance, we make them do it. And what we're seeing and what we're hearing is, well, we see it in videos all the time, right? This is what the officers are doing. They're following their training, but then they're using unwarranted force against people with disabilities because they're not trained to recognize disability. And it's been incredible how excited the officers are and the first responders are to get this information. We're teaching dispatchers and they're thrilled because they have so much ability to get information before the officers even go out. And then the officers just haven't been given these tools, right? They don't know about overstimulation. They don't know about sensory overload and to peel back. They've never been taught this and they're so excited. It's fun because we're doing 5 and 8 hour trainings and no officer wants to go to a disability training, especially an 8-hour disability training. They're all like, ugh. And so we've had people come up afterward and say, we really thought this was going to suck and it was the best training I've had in my career. Right now, we have over 97% of first responders that we've trained saying that they would highly recommend this and recommend this for other first responders, which is pretty incredible when you're talking about a disability training. And we've trained over 1,200 first responders at this point. So it's been so well received. I think the most fun is getting to hear the after stories. A lot of officers reach out later and say, hey, I never thought this distraction technique you taught us was going to work. And it totally worked. This is what happened. And we didn't have to use force. And just about every training, somebody comes up and says, I think my son might have autism, or I think my nephew. I've had a couple people come up and say, oh my gosh, I think I'm on the spectrum because we talk so much about these are the characteristics. So many people are, 85% of people with disabilities don't have an obvious or a recognizable disability from the get-go. I'm having so much fun with it. And I feel like I'm making a difference again.
Yeah. And as a trainer, I have to ask, what have you learned about the art of training through these experiences?
Yeah. So training law enforcement is a different beast, and firefighters and dispatchers. I mean, first responders in and of themselves, I've trained for years. I was a national trainer for domestic violence investigation. Pretty much my entire career, I've done first responder training, but it's been really interesting to see the differences in the departments and what their experiences and their department experiences bring to them. For instance, our Arvada Police Department is an amazing department, but they had just had the officer ambushed when we went in and trained them. And that very much influenced their reactions to some of the scenarios that we did. So I've really had to pay very close attention to the kind of atmosphere at each individual department more so than I've had to in the past, because we're totally trying to shift their paradigm on what we've been taught for 30 years. Now I'm saying, oh, wait, unless there's, a weapon or an imminent threat of physical harm, you need to back off, not go hands on. And it's completely different than what we've been taught in the past. It's just, I've had to do some research before going into some departments, so I know where to tread lightly. It's been amazing.
So if someone were to attend one of your trainings, what are some, big lessons that they can expect to walk away with?
We talk about perceptions, first of all, and we talk about the fact that perception is reality. I tell a story of how I'm afraid of sharks, right? I'm definitely afraid of sharks because of Jaws and Shark Week and all these images of people and things getting attacked by sharks. And then I talk about the odds of me getting attacked by a shark are slim to none. And I know that, but the panic attacks in open water are absolutely real. And then we talk about in 2018, there were 61.3 million police citizen contacts in the United States. And that same year, less than 1,000 people died at the hands of police. But the Rudderman Family Foundation did a study a few years prior showing that over 50% of people killed by police have a disability. And so those folks are inundated with images of people of color and people with disabilities getting killed by police. So even though we know that, the odds of getting killed by police are 0.00163%, that panic and that fear is absolutely real. And we need to approach these with compassion and an understanding that they're really scared and that fear is real, even though we know the odds of someone getting killed in a police encounter are low statistically, right?
Mhm.
So we kind of start with that. And it's kind of a wake-up call for officers that, we need to know what they're thinking too. And then we go really deep into characteristics of various disabilities, because a lot of first responders don't know anyone with CP or with Down syndrome or, and I want them to know that cerebral palsy could present showing the same signs as DUI. We have slurred speech, we have unsteady gait, we're going to have some weaving probably if somebody has significant CP in their driving. So we talk a lot about characteristics. We talk a lot about characteristics of sensory disorders, and that, if you go hands-on, you are going to force a fight or flight and it's going to be bad, So we talk a lot about characteristics, not so they can diagnose, but so they can have these red flags and kind of, oh, wait, Allie said this, maybe this, one of the lieutenants at a department put it well. Because he said, how are we supposed to know if they're a jerk? He used a different word, or they have a disability. How are we supposed to know this? Well, you don't. So if you slow down, you'll figure it out pretty quickly, because the jerk will continue to get belligerent. Whereas if we peel back that stimulation, if we slow things down, the people with disability are going to be able to process better. And then we go into a lot of anti-escalation is what I call it, anti-escalation techniques, like, okay, they're not listening to our verbal commands. What do we do? Because we haven't taught cops that, right? And it's slow it down, be patient, use your resources, try this, and I give them a bunch of tools. And then we talk about de-escalation techniques. And then we do a lot of scenarios. And all of our scenarios are real life based. They're all recordings, either body camera recorded by other people. And we break them down and say, what's going well? What could they be doing better? What techniques do you want to try on this that we've talked about? And it's been so well received.
Yeah. And do you have any examples of stories that you've heard after these trainings of these lessons being put into practice?
Yeah, absolutely. We've gotten a lot back. One of my favorite was 2 days after we gave the training, I got a phone call and the guy was like, I couldn't believe it. They got dispatched to a woman who was overwhelmed. She was acting out. She was very frustrated. I'm not sure what her disability is. It wasn't important, but she was literally throwing things in the school office because they weren't letting her get her child out. She was out of control when they got dispatched. And he's like, I totally thought we were going to have to go hands-on given what dispatch said. He said, but we got there and my partner and I had just taken your class and we used a distraction technique and we asked, hey, because what I teach them is ask something that has nothing to do with the call you're on. So if somebody's suicidal, ask, do you have a dog or what's your favorite sports team? Because it might be enough to stop the spiral and have them. And it's worked with me every single time. When I was at the AG's office, I did a card trick. And so I'm not adding to stimulation, but they were like, why is she doing a card trick when I'm losing my mind? Right. So he asked, his partner asked that day, hey, do you have a dog? And she stopped and looked at him like he was crazy. And she was like, yeah. He's like, do you have a picture you can show me? And it stopped it. And she was like, yeah, let me get a picture. And she showed him a picture and they were able to slow it down and get her calmed down. They didn't have to use force. And so it's really hard to quantify when force isn't used. So it's hard to get data points on this. There was a gentleman who called me there was a person he was interacting with who was nonverbal. And I always put nonverbal in air quotes because my daughter's nonverbal. She communicates very well. I joke that she's the loudest, bossiest nonverbal person you'll ever meet, which is true. But he said, before your class, I never would have known how to talk to this person, communicate with this person. He said, but we were out there with medics and the person was crying and screaming and hitting themselves. And he asked, is there something you need? And the person stopped. He's like, can you show me? And it was just taking those, speaking to someone like you would speak to anybody else, but understanding that they're going to communicate in a different way. And we talk a lot about all behavior is communication. I say that like 8 times in my class. So it's been amazing to hear the after stories and know that what we're teaching really does work. And it gives the officers the ability to have alternative tools and possibly save their career. Well, I mean, it's so beneficial for everyone, right?
Yeah.
It's evening that playing field, and it's reasonable accommodations really for people with disabilities, but it's also saving officers from making a mistake that could impact their career and their departments.
And you have such a diversified background in law enforcement, which you touched on earlier. And so I wanted to ask if there were any experiences that you can think of in particular from that background that informed the curriculum that you've created.
Everything along the way has informed this curriculum. It's funny when you look back on your life and what directions the universe or the powers that be are pushing you into. Way back when, before I ever had kids, one of my lieutenants at the time came up to me and he's like, I want you to serve on the adult protection and a review team. And I never had a filter. And I immediately said, but I don't like old people. And he started laughing, and he's like, because I was like in my 20s, maybe. And he said, well, I think you're going to be good at this. And it's not just about old people. It's about people with disabilities. And I was like, okay. And it really became one of my passions before I realized it was going to be. And then, I had case after case, both at the sheriff's office and then when I went to the attorney general's office, that just taught me so much. There's a gentleman named Scott Modell. He has his PhD. He's out in Tennessee. He taught me a class on interacting or how to interview people who are nonverbal and really have it be admissible into court cases. And that's really before we knew my daughter was going to be nonverbal, right? So all of these professional things came into play. And then I had my son and daughter, and my son, he has level 1 autism or Asperger's, and my daughter has intellectual disabilities and she's nonverbal. And come to find out 3 years ago, I got diagnosed with ADHD. So, and I don't know if I would have even realized that had I not been researching this curriculum, right? Because you learn more about disability. You're like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
So everything kind of came together, and I wouldn't have the guts to do most of what I've done in my career, at least my later career, without my kids, because my kids really showed me, okay, you don't have to be verbal to communicate, right? And here's how you navigate some of that. And then I started coaching with Special Olympics. I'm a coach for the Special Olympic swim team up in Loveland. And a few years ago, I think in 2019, Governor Polis appointed me to the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council. I served as the chair of the Legislative and Public Policy Committee for a few years. I just stepped down from that because I still serve on the committee, but I no longer chair because I had a little too much going on. But through all of these experiences, I've gotten to, work on legislation and meet people with so many varied abilities. And it's just been an incredible journey. And now I get to take all of the silos and all of the things that I've done and put them together into this training that it's absolutely what I'm supposed to be doing right now.
Yeah. That's great. And I did want to ask about being appointed to the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council. And, that's a really big deal. So what kind of work are you a part of there?
Yeah, so it's been incredible. I've been a member it's a 3-year term, and then he reappointed me last year. So I'm 4.5 years in now. And I've gotten to, again, just work on incredible things. We have grants that we give out to promote inclusion of people with developmental disabilities. My focus has been on legislative and public policy because I really have a heart for legislation and having the legal career and the law enforcement career. I got to help write House Bill 2111 14 or 1014. I'd have to look, sorry. But we got it's a disability indicator on a driver's license. And when it first came to the council, I don't know if you know of Josh Winkler. He works for Lieutenant Governor Primavera now. He is an incredible person. But he came into a council meeting, and he's one of the funniest human beings that you'll ever meet. But Josh came in and said, hey, we have this idea that's going to fix interactions between police and people with disabilities. We're going to put an indicator, a marker on their driver's license to show that they have a disability. And I was dying. I'm like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Because most of these interactions go south long before the driver's license comes out, right?
Right.
It goes south quick. I said, and I think that it's going to just lead to discrimination. I said, but what you need is, if you want to to impact traffic stops, let's put a field on a license plate so that if I run the license plate as a cop, I'm behind him, code 2, here's a license plate. Dispatch can come back and say, be advised, a driver has a disability or a passenger might have a disability. So I know as an officer that it might not go as planned. And so that got added in. A lot of people in the disabled community did want the indicator on the driver's license, especially the deaf community, which I get. I have the indicator on my license plate. So when you run my license plate, I have that indicator for my kids, especially now that my son's starting to drive. It's so scary. But I've advised my son not to get it on his driver's license because he doesn't immediately appear to have a disability. And I don't want, when he's going to get an apartment, I don't want a landlord or something to say, no, they never say based on that. And then we also had the opportunity to work on another piece of legislation because I said what we really need is training. And so Representative Daphne Mickelson-Janae ran the bill for the disability indicator, and then Representative Meg Froelich ran the bill for the training. And we were able to completely revise post-training for law enforcement, which is incredible. Prior to that bill, there were only 8 mentions of people with disabilities in the post-academy curriculum. Now they're required to do an 8-hour special populations class, which I teach in about 5 of the academies now. And they're required to do a 4-hour mental health, which was kind of part of the other one, but they intersect so much. And so it was incredible. That we were able to really look at, hey, this is a training issue. We aren't giving the officers the tools, and we were able to address that through the legislation. So clearly I have a passion for people with disabilities. I have a passion for law enforcement because that's, who I am. And so it's been amazing to be able to really make a difference. And push for those bills and help write those bills and testify for those bills. And because I get to testify at both Senate hearings on those. And it's been amazing.
Yeah. And so I know, you're talking about your passion for disability and education. And as you've talked about, I know a lot of that comes from being a mom to your son and daughter. And so I wanted to know if you have any advice for parents of children with disabilities.
Absolutely. We're actually starting a parent class. A couple advocacy groups have asked us and hired us to come in and speak with parents because there's things that we can do as parents if we have to call law enforcement because something has gone wrong and our kids are out of control or missing or something like that. There are things we can provide to law enforcement to make it go smoother. And it's really let dispatch know straight up, my son has a disability. My son has autism. This is what he's sensitive to. This is what calms him down. Because as parents of people with disabilities know, especially people who have behaviors, sometimes we know how to calm them down, but they're mad at us. They're directed at us. And so no matter what we do, it's not going to work. But if an officer has to come, it's going to be a very bad day. Let's say my daughter is having behaviors and I have to call. I want those officers to know that my daughter loves unicorns and can be calmed down through a Disney song, because if I play a Disney song at that point, it's just going to escalate her. But if they come in with a unicorn or a sticker, that could really de-escalate them. So providing that information from the get-go and reinforcing it throughout the call so the officers know my son or daughter has a disability. This is what's happening. This is what calms them down. Then you're providing those officers with those tools because we can't expect them to know everything. Right? We can't expect them to have this knowledge of every single person because every single person's different.
Yeah. And that's something we really try to teach, me personally through the trainings that I do when I talk about disability considerations is that it is so individualized. And so the best practice is always going to be based on what the individual or those close to the individual are telling you.
Exactly. And you have to pay attention to those nonverbals and those communications and just try to figure out what the issue is and solve it. Right? Or alleviate it. All behavior is either because you want something or want to get rid of something, right? It's either you want to get rid of the overstimulation or, you're thirsty or, if we can figure out what someone's trying to communicate through their behavior, then we can de-escalate the behavior. We can try to solve it or at least keep them safe while they go through the meltdown or the whatever's happening. Keep them safe, keep everybody else safe and let them fatigue out if need be. That's kind of that's what we teach, rather than, hey, they're not listening they're not putting their hands on their head like you asked them to. Let's, use force and make them do it.
Yeah. And are there any areas of inaccessibility that you yourself or your kids face often that you kind of just wish, everyone would know about?
Yes. we've, we've had quite a time with our educational experiences with both my kids. My son is twice exceptional. So he is brilliant. He has super high test scores, but they put him in AP classes and he was completely overwhelmed. He couldn't keep up and wound up failing a bunch of classes, even though we had the 504. And they were like, well, we'll give him more time. That doesn't help because more and more is still piling up and he's overwhelmed. And then with my daughter, just she has all kinds of stuff going on. She has paralysis of her oral motor function. So she can't speak well, if she has some intonations, but she uses sign for the most part. And she also has an auditory processing disorder. And every single year we have to go through the same thing of auditory processing is like dyslexia, right? You can hear fine, but somewhere between your hearing and your brain, it gets jumbled, just like between your eyes and your brain with dyslexia, it gets jumbled, right? And so she pretends to understand things and people just start talking to her. It's like, ooh, she's not getting 50% of what you're saying. She's playing unified basketball this year, and her coach said they have different hoops for different abilities, right? So they have a low basketball hoop for the kids that are using wheelchairs, and they have a hula hoop for some of the children that can't make it to the upper hoop. Well, my daughter's 5'7", and she can reach the upper hoop, right? So he said, Amelia, aim for the big hoop. And I jumped up because I knew to her, the big hoop is the hula hoop, right? Yeah. It's not the tall hoop. And I was like, oh, Rob, she has no idea what you just told her. I'm like, Amelia, aim for the tall hoop. You have to aim for the regular hoop. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. But it's that kind of thing that, we don't expect everybody to know, but once we say it, you need to slow it down. You need to have a visual reminder. So it's frustrating when you have to go year after year and say the same thing. She needs a sign or a visual reminder for her to comprehend this. And I wound up pulling my son out of typical brick and mortar school because I had to make the decision, which is more important, his mental health or his education. And we decided his mental health was more important. He was, suicidal at the end because he was failing everything and he couldn't do anything right. And so it's been a hard road. At times, I wish folks would just listen and ask questions and not just assume they know what's best based on their experiences with other people with autism they might know.
Absolutely. And my last question would be, is there anything else you want our listeners to know, whether that be about training, parenting, disability, or anything else?
We're here as a resource. We are not a nonprofit. We are a for-profit, but we are working with some nonprofits to help support kind of smaller agencies and some of these advocacy groups to be able to bring the education out there. My biggest thing is just be patient. With everybody. You have to be patient with people with disabilities. You have to be patient with their parents, right? Because we're doing the best we can. These special needs parenting is not for the weak. It's really hard. And we need to be patient with our first responders because they have not been given this information. So the more communication we can have between everyone, and the more relationships we can build. The way I end my trainings is I ask at the very beginning, who has someone in their life with a disability? And a lot of people feel comfortable sharing, some don't. Through the class, a lot more people come out and say, oh, my cousin had this, right? And so, but I say at the end, for those of you who don't have someone in your life with a disability, go find some people, like go volunteer for Special Olympics, go to your special needs classrooms, because when you get to know and build relationships with people who aren't like you, you realize everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants love. Everybody wants to be included, and everybody wants to feel like they're giving back, like they're helping and contributing. Right. And so if we can help facilitate some of that, then that fear goes away, because so much of, this unknown is based out of the fear of making a mistake, of saying something wrong. And the more you get to know people who aren't like you, whether it's ability or religion or race or whatever, the more we realize we're all the same deep down inside. And so that's kind of what I encourage. And that we lose some of our oversensitivity and say, hey, I've never met anybody like you. Can you tell me more about it? Or what can I do to make this easier for you? Right? It's okay to ask questions.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one thing I can take away from this interview is that there's so much more to learn from you. There's so many, good nuggets that can be taken away from your curriculum, from your training. So where can listeners go to learn more about Pulseline Collaborative Training?
Yeah. So our website is pulseline.org or www.pulseline.org. And my email's on there. You can Google Pulseline Collaborative Training. And if anybody has any questions, they can reach out to me via email or, I think my number's even on there. They can text me. So we're happy to help however we can. We when we first started this company, the big joke was we're going to save the world. And that's always been, we want to fix things. We want to abolish unwarranted use of force. We want to make things better for people with varying abilities as well as first responders. So yeah, reach out.
Allie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Tess Stanton, and Jessica Lucania is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, grant number 90DPAD0014. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.